What's happening, A-Push students? This is a mammoth chapter. Chapter 25, America moves to the city, 1865 to 1900. This one goes into the rapid urbanization of the United States during this time period of 1865 to 1900. Remember that we are still in the Gilded Age, so anything you've learned about political corruption and industrialization are all factors into what is going on. This chapter talks more about immigration and the experiences of immigrants, especially in cities. And it also goes into some social issues and religious issues related to conflicts between science and religion. It talks about the development of African American resistance to Jim Crow laws, the development of public education, journalism, newspapers, as well as some artistic movements that were prominent at the time. So it is a lot. Let's get started. Just to give you an idea of how rapid urbanization was during this time, in 1860 there was no city in the United States that had 1 million inhabitants. So all the populations of cities were under 1 million people. By 1890, however, both Chicago and New York are going to pass that mark with 1 million inhabitants. And by 1900, New York City has a population of 3.5 million, making it the second largest city in the world. This is indicative of larger world trends, as between 1850 and 1900, world cities such as London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, or Moscow doubled or tripled in population. Because of the development of steel production, cities were able to grow vertically as well as horizontally, and with the construction of skyscrapers, more people could live in cities than before. Electricity was invented around this time, which allowed for safer lighting of buildings and the operation of electrical devices such as elevators. Electricity could also be used to power rail cars or streetcars, which allowed for more people to move more rapidly around cities. It's during this time that you're going to see a very, very slow development of suburbs because people can now live a little farther outside of the city and commute in on these forms of public transportation. We learned about industrialization last chapter, so all these new products that can be shipped and moved around the country and can be built in factories are now for sale in department stores. These stores attracted urban middle-class shoppers where they were offered any range of consumer products. We're going to get to this more when we talk about immigrants, but one of the most common building designs in the mid to late 1800s was the dumbbell tenement apartment building, which many of these new immigrants are going to inhabit. And I'll show a picture of one of these in just a second and explain it to you. Cities were a very dangerous place to live during this time. Not only was there crime in many parts of the city, but there were so many people packed together, this led to unsanitary conditions and pollution. The biggest risk, however, was going to be fires. In 1871, the city of Chicago experienced a fire that burned down 2/3 of the entire city. Rumors were circulated that Mrs. O'Leary's cow had knocked over a lantern, which then ignited a barn and spread to the rest of the city. This is unfounded as a claim, but I hope this makes you think about not only how dangerous cities could be, but also that story kind of contains some pretty clear anti-Irish bias with the cow's owner being Mrs. O'Leary. And we're going to get into that as well when we talk about immigrants in this chapter. Again, just showing how New York and Chicago expanded. This shows their population in 1850 versus their population in 1900. This is happening all over the world, and it's very, very rapid. This is a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was the first bridge to connect Manhattan to Brooklyn. At the time of its construction, it was also the largest suspension bridge in the world. I put it here and I mention it because at the time it was a serious achievement in engineering to be able to make a bridge this large. The distance between the two towers is about 1,600 feet, and the cables were made of steel. Not only that, but you can guess who built this bridge? Immigrant labor. So this bridge, to many historians, represents a combination of technological developments, engineering, ambition, hard work, and optimism that kind of define this era. Understanding how the Brooklyn Bridge was constructed and who built it tells us a lot about what was going on during this time period. This is what I was saying earlier is the dumbbell tenement design. So on the right and left sides, you're looking at the front of the street and the back alley. These buildings were built side by side, so from the front of the house, you couldn't see any gaps. Each building was a maximum of about 6 stories tall. So each story had a similar design with 4 apartment buildings for each floor. In between each building was an air shaft meant to provide ventilation, which gives it the name dumbbell because you can see how it's shaped. If you were in the back bedroom, you wouldn't get a lot of air from the street, so the intent of the air shaft was to allow air to flow through because you had windows in that area. However, this design is going to lead to a number of problems. For one thing, if you lived on the 5th and 6th floor, you didn't really like to take your garbage out very much, so sometimes these air shafts would get full of garbage from the upper floors. Not only that, but if there was a fire in one of these buildings, the air shaft acted kind of like a wind tunnel and sucked a lot of oxygen in, which would make the fire spread a lot quicker. These tenement buildings were so dangerous that the design was revised by the city, and in New York City in particular, in 1898, the construction of dumbbell tenements was banned. They had to make new designs for more safe tenement buildings. So that doesn't mean that you still can't see them in New York City. So if you ever go and you're in Lower Manhattan, you are going to see a lot of these 6-story dumbbell tenements, which is kind of a defining feature of that region of the city. And that is the area that a lot of these immigrants are going to move into because it's one of the cheaper places to live in New York. Immigration is going to explode during this time period in American history. Between the 1850s and 1870s, there were 2 million immigrants that came to America. So that's in the span of about 20, 30 years. Just in the 1880s alone, there are going to be 5 million immigrants. Until the 1880s, most immigrants came from the British Isles and Western Europe, mainly Germany and Ireland, which we've already talked about. And let's not forget also the 300,000 Chinese immigrants who came to the United States during this time. So starting in the 1880s, we're going to see the emergence of what are called the new immigrants, who are coming from different regions of Europe. During this time in American history, a majority of these new immigrants are going to come from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this includes places like Italy, Croatia, Slovakia, Poland, and Russia, among others. In these countries, there was a lot of civil conflict and economic depression, particularly in Russia for the Jewish population, who are being displaced by the Tsar's oppressive government policies. So those are some push factors that we can look at. There's also, lessening economic opportunities in Europe. As we already talked about, there's no available land really for cultivation. So you're going to see a lot of push factors in convincing immigrants to leave their home country and come to the United States. So again, what does America offer? What are the pull factors that bring people to America? Well, there's a lot of available opportunities for work, especially in these new industries. And industries wanted to hire immigrant labor because they were willing to work for lower wages. If you were willing to travel out west, there was a lot of opportunity to gain land. So you're going to see maybe really 2 paths for immigrants that come into the United States. Some are going to stay in the city for a very short while, and they're going to just move out west and try to settle in those areas, so continue to move west. But an equal number are just going to stay in the city and try to build their opportunity there. And so you're going to see that's why the population of New York City really does explode during this time. And all of these immigrant groups are going to experience a pressure to assimilate into American society. And some of that is external and some of that is kind of internal. They're going to implement various ways of preserving their cultures at the same time. So there's this push to become more American and adapt to the American way of life, but there's a lot of groups who don't want to lose their traditional cultures and their traditional cultural practices. And that includes a lot of different things. So, some ways of preserving culture was the establishment of foreign language newspapers in a lot of cities. There are Catholic and Hebrew schools that are established in cities to preserve religious traditions. And there are stores that offer ethnic food. For example, like the Jewish kosher tradition. There are a lot of kosher food stores. Even to this day in New York City, still has one of the largest Jewish populations in the United States. There's also something important to note about immigration and the trends we see in American history. When we look at assimilation of immigrant groups, there is usually a 3-generation pattern to when immigrants come over and become more assimilated into American society, particularly with those groups that don't have English as their first language. So the first generation of immigrants, these are the people who moved to America and were born somewhere else. Most often they don't learn to speak English and maybe stick to, within their smaller ethnic communities. The second generation of immigrants, which are their children, typically speak both English and their other language. And by the third generation, their children speak English but may not speak their ancestral languages. So what you see in a lot of immigrant stories is there's a push to assimilate from these groups, but there's also this resistance in keeping their ethnic and religious traditions preserved at the same time. That's why you have in cities these smaller ethnic communities like there are Chinatowns, there are Little Italys, there are, all different, depending on the ethnic groups that settled in these areas, you can find these little ethnic enclaves still in cities today. Some of it's manufactured, whereas like most of Little Italy in New York City isn't really occupied by Italian Americans today. Here is a chart that shows immigration over time in American history. So you can see that the 1880s is a substantial increase in the number of immigrants. Now, keep in mind, these figures can sometimes be misleading because, there are more people than ever before, in the present day. So, I mean, statistically, one of the largest, amounts of immigration that we've experienced in American history is in this period between 1880 and 1900. You're going to see each of these, dips and each of these peaks has a story. In particular, we're going to be looking at, 1924. That's when widespread immigration restriction is going to be implemented, and then the immigration system is going to be replaced by a quota system in this time period. And then during the Reagan administration, there was amnesty given to undocumented immigrants that were in the United States. So, each of these has its own little story, but I want to focus quickly on this one right here as where we are in American history. Okay. So this is a chart that just reinforces what I was saying earlier, the shift from Northern and Western Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe as the main sources of immigrants to the United States. We talked about the Irish, and we kind of are looking at 2 or 3 generations in for this big influx of Irish immigration from the 1840s. And so now we are seeing that the discrimination and exclusion from society and this nativism is going to be directed at these new immigrant groups. Here is an English language class in a settlement house. And so these are immigrants who are trying to, learn the language and kind of find their opportunities. When we think of immigrants during this time, I think this is an image that a lot of people think of. You have, kind of the family trying to seek better opportunities, bringing everything they have on a boat most likely because many came by ship. And then Ellis Island was the processing center for immigrants who came to New York City. And so there's a lot of iconic images associated with immigration during this time. Cities were a pretty insane place to live back then. I mean, imagine just all of the excitement and all the danger and all of the different people and all the different cultures and food and sights and sounds and smells associated with the city. It was a very, very chaotic place to live, but also kind of an exciting place to live. And I mean, imagine, the population of New York is tripling between, 18, like during the late 1800s. So it's just, the growth is explosive, and it's just kind of this cauldron of excitement. Here is what we would actually call a sweatshop. Okay, I mean, many of the women that came to the United States, low-income immigrant women, are going to work in the garment district assembling clothing. And so we're going to see that a lot of the work that immigrants can attain is going to be low wage, poor working conditions. Again, we're going to bring unionization into this a little bit later and talk more about that. In helping immigrants assimilate into American society, the United States government was completely hands-off in this pursuit. State governments did even less, and city governments were too overwhelmed with trying to accommodate the building of the city to really address this issue. So new immigrants faced discrimination, and nativist groups tried to block their employment or movement throughout the city. So if you're, imagine you're a poor immigrant who just came to the United States. You might not really know English, you're facing discrimination, you work in low-wage jobs, and you fall on difficult times, and there's not a lot of places you can go, and the government is not there to help you, okay? The groups that ended up reaching out to these immigrants are going to be urban political machines and urban reformers. So let's talk about those real quick and the role that they played. Your book briefly mentioned the Tweed Ring from chapter 23 and the corruption that they are known for. So I want to bring that back up and talk about that a little bit more in the context of immigration. What an urban political machine was when a powerful political boss had influence and control over city politics, and they used their position to give government building contracts to their friends and associates in exchange for bribes and kickbacks. A kickback is basically when you get money to look the other way, or, there's a lot of embezzlement when the cost of building projects was overestimated by the government, and the government pays for those things, but then, the cost ends up being lower, and then people end up pocketing the difference. Boss Tweed and the Tammany Society to which he belongs, which was also known as Tammany Hall, was one of the most powerful and successful groups in achieving this, and they're based in New York City. Over time, we don't know how much money Boss Tweed and his associates actually took, but it's somewhere in the millions. And you're probably wondering that if they were so corrupt, how did they stay in power? Well, they stayed in power by courting these immigrants who could vote, and they helped immigrants find work or assisted them when times were difficult for them. They would do things like help them find housing, help people with their heating bills, straighten out small legal problems, or get through bureaucracy. They built schools, parks, orphanages. They would pass out turkeys, and this would be in exchange for the immigrants to vote for them and keep them in power. So at a time when most people didn't want anything to do with these immigrants, these urban political machines are going to help immigrants in exchange for votes and use those votes to remain in power. So there's this kind of paradoxical nature of the political machines. They did help a lot of people. They helped a lot of immigrants that society wasn't willing to help. But at the same time, they were super corrupt, and they kept a lot of money for themselves and their friends. So on the other side of this was a slew of urban reform organizations whose goal it was to help immigrants assimilate into American society and give them the skills and education necessary to be successful. One of the most famous urban reformers in American history is Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in an immigrant neighborhood in Chicago in 1889. Hull House offered English instruction, childcare, educational opportunities, and cultural activities for these new immigrants, and it gave new immigrants a gathering place and a means for self-improvement. Hull House was just one of many settlement houses in American cities dedicated to helping immigrants find their way in the United States. So here is an example of a cultural event or a choir singing in one of these settlement houses. We talked about nativism in this class before, so this is not new in American history, but now the discrimination is going to be leveled against these new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Since many of them were Catholic or Jewish, and many had different complexions than your average Englishman or Irishman, these immigrants were seen by nativists as culturally and religiously inferior. Immigrants received the blame for the corruption in city governments, and people were alarmed because their birth rates were very high, so nativists feared that it would lead to a degradation of the Anglo-Saxon race. Many new immigrants also carried ideas of socialism, communism, and anarchism, which, you remember from chapter 24, unions were also, wary of immigrants because they were willing to work for lower wages. So, they were seen as religiously and culturally different. They had radical, ideas, and they could work for lower wages. So in addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which specifically was targeted at banning the Chinese, there are some partial bans on immigration, but these are just restricted to people with criminal records. So they're not really, as much as nativists probably would have wanted. At the same time this is going on, the Statue of Liberty, which was a gift from the French for our centennial in 1876, was finally placed in New York Harbor in 1886. So immigrants that are going through processing at Ellis Island in New York City would go by the Statue of Liberty, and for many this became a symbol of freedom and acceptance of these new immigrant groups. Let's shift gears and talk about how religion is going to change in America during this time. Because so many people were moving to cities, many churches became mere diversions or amusements instead of cultural or social focus of a rural agricultural community. Not only that, but many of these churches are raising opposition to urban life and many of the social and economic problems that come with living in a city and being exposed to different things. So out of this comes a new generation of liberal Protestants that tried to reconcile new scientific ideas with old religious doctrines. These are some of the groups that are going to be a little less literal in their interpretation of the Bible and are going to try to direct their pastoral efforts towards social reform in the cities. Some of the efforts of these new religious groups include the Salvation Army, which was a charitable organization rooted in Christian traditions, as well as the Young Men's and Young Women's Christian Association, known as the YMCA and YWCA, which combined physical education with religious instruction. I have also heard that it's fun to stay there. Sorry about the dad joke. Let's keep going. Okay, so because people are moving to cities, they are exposed to many different cultures, ideas, ways of thinking, and experiences, arguably more than they might experience in a small farm town. When this happens, there's sometimes a challenge from religion against what they feel is too much of a cultural change that is going to undermine Christian values. So one scientific idea that is going to face a lot of criticism during this time are the ideas of Charles Darwin and his theories on evolution. Darwin had published his works in the 1820s, but it took a while for these ideas to generally be accepted by the scientific community. When a majority of scientists embraced the theory of organic evolution, this is sometime in the 1870s, religious groups split into two camps. There was a conservative minority who believed the Bible was the Word of God and should be interpreted as literally as possible. So, kind of the idea that the earth was created in 7 days, right? Or, well, 6 days. The more liberal majority of Christians did not accept the majority of the Bible as history or science, and they found ways to reconcile Darwinism with Christianity. I bring this up because we see in American society a clash between modern values and traditional values, and we see this happening today, just as much as we see it happening back in this time period. In the 1920s, there's going to be a trial in rural Tennessee where a teacher is put on trial for teaching about evolution in school. And this trial, is going to capture people's imagination because it represents the cultural clashes between traditional and modern values that were taking place. So, I ask you to think about modern ideas that are being challenged by traditional groups in today's society, and just remember that during the late 1800s, one of the sticking points in society was over the acceptance of Charles Darwin's theories on evolution. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's useful to know that public education is climbing during this time. Remember Horace Mann from the antebellum reformers and his push for more funding for education. By 1870 and onwards, you're going to see more states making grade school compulsory, which is, this is partially done to try to combat the growing number of children that are being employed in factories. So during the 1880s and 90s, you're going to see an expansion of high schools that are taxpayer supported, meaning supported by taxpayer money. By 1900, there are 6,000 high schools in the United States where they also have textbooks that are being paid for by taxpayers. Over the course of the 20th century, you're going to see schooling up to high school become free to students and required up to a certain point. If you're looking at urbanization from this time and the social problems being created such as poverty and disease, and you have this huge influx of immigrants that are trying to improve themselves, for many urban reformers, education was seen as a means of improvement and a solution to some of these growing problems. By 1900, the illiteracy rate in the United States was around 11%. However, the illiteracy rate for non-white Southerners was 44%, meaning that African Americans in the South, because of Jim Crow segregation or a lack of educational services, and combine that with the threat of lynching, they remained an underclass in society. Out of this context come two prominent African American leaders who proposed widely different solutions to this issue. The first is from Booker T. Washington, who is going to be a proponent of black education. He's going to found the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama for the purpose of helping educate African Americans in useful trades. His theory basically is that African Americans need to develop economic security and self-respect in their own communities, and eventually their example will allow them to assimilate into white society and become more accepted. To kind of contrast that viewpoint, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to found the NAACP in 1909 with the purpose of pushing for complete equality for African Americans, including social and economic rights. He rejects what he considers a gradual approach from Booker T. Washington, or an accommodationist approach, and believed that African Americans were not going to be given their rights at any time and instead would have to fight and agitate for them. He's the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard and argues for what he calls the talented 10th, which is basically the top 10% of educated and skilled African Americans to be given immediate access to mainstream American life. So, to summarize Booker T. Washington a little bit more, he's an advocate for economic development and self-help within the black community, kind of separate from the white society, and W.E.B. Du Bois wants to directly agitate and push for the immediate acceptance into the larger society. Both of these philosophies are empowering to the black community, but in different ways. And in the early 1900s, President Teddy Roosevelt is going to invite one of these leaders to the White House. I want you to think about who Teddy Roosevelt might invite to the White House and what that says about Teddy Roosevelt's, ideas about race, okay? Before the Civil War, a lot of colleges and universities had a lot more religious instruction as pillars of their curriculum. Harvard, for example, was founded as a theological school. After the Civil War, you're going to see a little bit more inclusion of sciences and engineering as parts of a well-rounded college education. There are going to be a lot more opportunities for women and African Americans in higher education after the Civil War with the founding of historically black colleges and women's colleges. During the Civil War and the Lincoln administration, the Morrill Act of 1862 granted public lands for supportive education. And part of the land grants that the government gave these colleges required that they provide agricultural education and engineering and other studies that were considered more practical. Many of the land grant colleges that were established from this act include the University of California system, Ohio State, Texas A&M, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. Not only that, but you had a lot of private philanthropists who donated large amounts of their fortunes to establishing schools. The Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore is one example. The University of Chicago received huge amounts of money from John D. Rockefeller. In the last chapter, I talked about Carnegie Mellon University from Andrew Carnegie. And the head of the Union Pacific Railroad, Leland Stanford, is going to donate money to establish a school in California. So, a mix of government action and philanthropy is going to increase the amount of higher educational opportunities in the United States. I mean, that being said, the number of people graduating from college is still a very small percentage of the population. And we see that over time, these reforms in education are going to lead to a much higher, graduation rate. So, even though there were more opportunities for college, college really wasn't a requirement for pretty much any job. Okay. Libraries were popular in the United States, and they were in many major cities. The Library of Congress opened its current building in 1897. Andrew Carnegie donated $60 million to build 1,700 public libraries across the USA. You remember that's kind of part of his gospel of wealth philosophy. By 1900, there were 9,000 free circulating libraries in America, each with over 300 books. So anyway, literacy is growing and libraries are growing. Circulation of information is growing in this time in America. Newspapers were also becoming much more common because of the invention of new typesetting technology. Not only that, but railroads and increased transportation allowed for newspapers to increase their circulation across the country. Two tycoons, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, were competing newspaper men during this time. Their newspapers were nationally circulated, and since they relied on subscriptions, you're going to see a lot of these newspapers become very sensationalist. Now that means that they kind of over-exaggerated their stories to try to draw readers in with really sensational headlines. Maybe they were a little thin on truth. Think about clickbait articles you see on the internet. Kind of compare that to how these newspapers might have operated during this time. You click on that article and it's got a headline that really draws you in, but it turns out to not be about anything at all and just tries to sell you things. Okay, so on the other hand, they did draw attention to a lot of social causes and things that they wanted to pay attention to improve society. But on the other hand, they also had a lot of articles that were pretty low on factual information and pretty high on scandal. So it's due to this, and also the mascot for one of the cartoons from the New York World, pictured here, that his name is Yellow Kid, that this type of newspaper publication is going to be known as yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is going to play a large part in America's move towards going to war with Spain in 1898. We are a ways away from that now, but it's useful to know that these newspapers had a tendency to exaggerate facts, and they are going to become more widespread over this time. Again, as literacy grew in the United States, and as societies became more interconnected, so did the proliferation of magazines and magazine subscriptions. Harper's Weekly is going to be one of the most famous, as well as Scribner's and The Nation. These magazines are going to report on the news, but they're also going to be advocating for things like civil service reform, honesty in government, issues related to tariff. Overall, there's a lot of people who are trying to reform government and get government to take more of an active role in helping improve society. So one example of this time, from this time period, comes from Henry George, whose book Progress in Poverty acknowledged that the advances of the time period were also creating a large amount of suffering for a lot of people. One of the things he proposes was a 100% property tax known as the single tax, which would then be used to eliminate poverty. Obviously, people who own property are going to be kind of freaked out by this, but George was looking out for people who didn't own land, who are mostly poor people in cities. So the book was incredibly popular. Other authors in this time were talking about how to improve society and make it better, and there's a small subgroup of these people known as utopian socialists. We've already talked about utopian communities before the Civil War, and we know about socialism, so combine those two into the idea that socialism would lead to a more harmonious society and a better world. Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward, is kind of like science fiction in that the protagonist of the book wakes up in the year 2000 and sees how much society has progressed from the 1880s. In the society depicted in Bellamy's book, the government has nationalized big businesses. And that, nationalizing something means that the government basically takes it over. So the government has taken over all the big businesses, and now those businesses are being steered towards serving the public good and the public interest. This book was very inspirational in inspiring people to form Bellamy clubs, and to try to make this happen. So there are people who are trying to bring more socialism, into society by having the government act on regulating big business or controlling big business. We've already talked about how urbanization is going to create some divisions and crises in the role that religion plays in society. Let's talk about how this is going to affect women's roles. Because of the emerging work opportunities in cities for women, especially more middle-class women, there's going to be an effect on the way women challenge the social order and societal norms. One example in particular is in the life of Victoria Woodhull, who was an open advocate for free love. She consistently pushed the envelope in calling out what she saw as society's shortcomings. And in 1872, she ran for president as a representative of the Equal Rights Party, with Frederick Douglass as her running mate. Now, she's sometimes credited with being the first female candidate for president, but some don't really acknowledge that because it wasn't one of the two major parties. But she stands out as a good example of people who were challenging society and how urbanization led to many more ideas being circulated. The government also got involved with trying to suppress what they felt was immoral actions and publications by passing the Comstock Act in 1873. The Comstock Law, rather, allowed the Postal Service to confiscate any pornographic material. And this also included literature that advised women on birth control options. Divorce rates were on a steady rise in the United States during the late 1800s, where in 1891, 1 out of 17 marriages ended in divorce. Obviously, this is different than the current statistic of 1 in every 2 marriages, but it was troubling enough for people to try to address what they felt was the crumbling of morality in the country. Young women took jobs in cities in professions like switchboard operators and typewriters, and many of these women found a degree of independence by living in cities. Dance halls and nightclubs were common, which gave these women a degree of freedom in the city. The cartoon pictured here is a cartoon that depicts Victoria Woodhull, kind of as a demon advocating for free love. So not a positive picture of Victoria Woodhull. From the cartoonist Thomas Nast, who you might have heard about before. So the suffragist movement continued to challenge society for voting rights and other opportunities. And by now, the 15th Amendment had been around for a while, so women's rights groups rejoined together into the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was still around, and she was from Seneca Falls and had helped form this organization as well. Susan B. Anthony had been arrested in 1872 for illegally casting a ballot in the presidential election. She also helped found this organization. So among these suffragists, who might be considered more militant, were other women who were appealing to opponents in different ways. Carrie Chapman Catt, for example, argued that giving women the right to vote would allow them to continue in their traditional duties as wife and mother and homemaker by being able to vote in local elections on school issues, for example. So, maybe not the most acceptable argument by today's standards, but at the same time, it did help win over some of the skeptics to giving women the right to vote, because many feared that it would basically upend societal norms and would reverse roles, and women would leave their homes, essentially. So a number of Western states do extend the right to vote to women during this time, with Wyoming being the first in 1869. However, we also saw this in abolitionist groups. The NAWSA excluded black women from their organizations, and they rationalized that an integrated campaign might compromise their ability to earn the vote, so black women's suffrage organizations are formed during this time period and operate separately. I also want to recognize Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a significant figure during this time in her work for trying to publicize lynchings in the United States, particularly against black men in the South. This shows when voting rights were attained for women in various states. And you can see that the West, prior to the 19th Amendment, women had the right to vote. But you're going to see that after the 19th Amendment is ratified, all those states, including all the states in the South, have to guarantee the right to vote to women. So remember the temperance movement from the Second Great Awakening? Well, the temperance movement gains a lot of momentum after this rapid urbanization, because you have a lot more immigration and more people living more closely together, and drinking in cities was pretty heavy, especially in this class of new immigrants, and there are bars and social halls and things like that. So it's in 1868 that the first political party formed around temperance, and it gains a small amount of votes in the presidential election. It's only going to gain more momentum from there. Under the leadership of Frances Willard, the Women's Christian Temperance Union continues to lobby Congress and pressure state legislatures to enact laws that limit or prohibit the sale and manufacture of alcohol. Prior to the 18th Amendment, which isn't ratified until 1919, there are a lot of states that had state laws that prohibited alcohol, and it's due to the efforts of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and others that led to this turn against alcohol. We'll talk about more why the 18th Amendment was ratified at the time it was and other circumstances surrounding it, but for now, you should know that temperance is a big social movement in America at the end of the 1800s. Other voices in the temperance movement include Carrie Nation, who is one of the more sensational figures of the temperance movement. She was from Kansas, and her first husband had died from alcoholism, and so she addressed the issue by going into saloons with a hatchet and smashing up all the liquor. This kind of caused a sensation, and she became known as the Kansas Cyclone. This does sound kind of cool, but at the same time, temperance organizations weren't really happy with her because it made the temperance movement look a little crazy. So think about how anarchism was tied to the Knights of Labor after Haymarket. It's kind of the same thing. Other reforms during this time include the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and the American Red Cross. So it's just important that you know women were instrumental in shaping these organizations, and they played a crucial role in their structure and leadership. So imagine you are drinking in a billiard hall and you have this scene where women are outside, basically publicly shaming you. It's actions like this, as well as legislation that leads to a reduction of alcohol consumption. This kind of starts in the West and moves out to the East. New inventions that we've already talked about, like electricity, is going to light up cities. And other inventions, such as the phonograph, is going to bring music into American homes. Architects and city planners are also going to try to reshape the look of cities in what's called the City Beautiful movement. And it was this idea that cities needed to not only look beautiful, but also needed to show harmony, order, and be impressive. And this leads to the construction of really grandiose buildings for things like the Grand Central Terminal in New York City. One such project in the City Beautiful movement was Central Park, which was designed in 1873. And its chief architect was Frederick Law Olmsted. And the intent for the park is kind of interesting. Olmsted wanted it to be a democratic place that was accessible to all the people. And part of the impact Olmsted was hoping was that lower class people would go to the park and see the upper class people and how they behaved. And hopefully some of those values and practices would kind of rub off on the poor people and improve them and make them into better citizens. People, according to Olmsted, people weren't supposed to play in the park. They weren't supposed to throw frisbees or sunbathe or do anything like that. They were just supposed to walk around and look at how other people lived and hopefully improve their lives that way. Given that Manhattan is a really small island, it's pretty impressive that Central Park encompasses such a large amount of real estate in one of the most expensive cities in the world. And the culmination of the City Beautiful movement, and something to talk about a little bit more, is the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Again, Columbia was a nickname for America, and so it was meant to be a public display of all this technology, improvements, and progress that America had gained over this time for the display of the rest of the world. Only 4 years prior to the exposition, the Eiffel Tower had been built in Paris, and Americans wanted to do something that would rival that. So an engineer named George Washington Gale Ferris designed the mechanical wheel that people could ride in, known as the Ferris wheel. Unfortunately, I'm out of time because Loom limits us to 45 minutes of recording for some reason. So I'm going to have to say this is it for this chapter. See me if you have any questions. Thank you for listening.